Nobody noticed the woman in seat 27C, not the flight attendant serving her ginger ale, not the businessman asking her to pass a pillow, not the 181 other passengers who assumed she was just another ordinary traveler. But when two F-22 Raptor pilots heard her call sign 3 hours later, they literally froze mid-flight, unable to speak, because they had just heard a legend come alive. Before you watch full story, comment your country below. Hit subscribe because tomorrow I'm bringing the best story yet. The Boeing 777 pushed back from Gate 47 at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport at precisely 6:47 p.m., carrying 183 souls toward what should have been a routine red-eye flight to San Diego. Among the passengers settling into their seats, adjusting pillows and queuing entertainment options on seatback screens, sat a woman in 27C who drew absolutely no attention whatsoever. She wore faded jeans, a plain gray hoodie, and white sneakers that had seen better days. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and reading glasses perched on her nose as she thumbed through a paperback mystery novel. The flight attendants rolled their beverage cart past her with the same polite smile they offered everyone, asking the standard questions about drinks and snacks without a second glance. The businessman in 27B asked her to pass him a pillow from the overhead bin, assuming from her casual appearance that she worked in retail or perhaps as a teacher. She handed it to him with a quiet, "Here you go," that carried no hint of authority or distinction. During the pre-flight safety demonstration, she didn't even look up from her book, having heard the oxygen mask and flotation device speech so many times it had become white noise. The elderly couple in row 26 struck up conversation during boarding, asking if she was traveling for business or pleasure. "Just heading home," she replied with an easy smile that revealed nothing. They nodded knowingly and launched into stories about visiting their grandchildren, assuming she led the same unremarkable civilian life they did. The flight attendant taking meal preferences marked her down for the pasta option without any special notation, treating her exactly like passenger 27C on a manifest of 183 ordinary people. As the massive aircraft thundered down runway 18R and lifted gracefully into the darkening Texas sky, not a single person aboard had any reason to believe that the quiet woman in the gray hoodie was anything other than completely, utterly ordinary. What none of them knew, what the smiling flight attendants, the chatty grandparents, the distracted businessman, and the 177 other passengers couldn't possibly have guessed, was that the woman in 27C had a military service record that read like aviation legend. Her personnel file, locked in classified databases at the Pentagon and Nellis Air Force Base, contained commendations and mission reports that made seasoned fighter pilots shake their heads in disbelief. She had flown combat missions in 3 theaters of operation, logged over 4,000 flight hours in 15 different aircraft types, and survived situations that killed pilots with twice her experience. Her specialty had been the impossible, bringing damaged aircraft home when all conventional procedures said to eject, executing rescue missions in conditions that grounded entire squadrons, and making split-second decisions under enemy fire that saved countless lives. She had test-piloted experimental aircraft that pushed the boundaries of human endurance, trained elite fighter pilots in advanced tactical maneuvers, and coordinated emergency responses during catastrophic military aviation incidents that would have ended in mass casualties without her intervention. Her call sign, earned during a mission that had become the stuff of legend in fighter pilot communities worldwide, was known and revered from Langley to Ramstein, from Kadena to Lakenheath. It represented a night when she had flown a crippled F-16 through a sandstorm with multiple system failures, enemy surface-to-air missiles tracking her damaged aircraft, and a critically wounded weapons systems officer bleeding out in the backseat. Conventional wisdom said the aircraft was unflyable, that ejection was the only option, that the mission was lost. She had brought that F-16 home through sheer skill, flying by instinct and feel when instruments failed, executing maneuvers that shouldn't have been possible with a damaged airframe, and landing the burning aircraft on a runway she could barely see through the sand and smoke. The weapons systems officer survived because of her refusal to abandon the aircraft. The mission succeeded because she completed the objective even with half her systems dead. Her call sign, assigned by fellow pilots who witnessed her achieve the impossible, became synonymous with never giving up, with finding a way when no way existed, with the kind of aviation mastery that separated legends from merely exceptional pilots. But tonight, dressed in civilian clothes and anonymous among ordinary travelers, she was just another passenger. She had deliberately chosen this invisibility, maintaining strict separation between her military service and her private life. No uniform, no insignia, no mention of her background to curious fellow travelers who assumed she worked in marketing or accounting or any of 1,000 unremarkable professions. She traveled this way intentionally, wanting the peace of anonymity, the relief of being just another face in the crowd rather than the decorated war hero whose reputation preceded her in military circles. The flight attendants saw a woman who ordered ginger ale and declined the overpriced snack box. The passengers around her saw someone who kept to herself, read quietly, and didn't hog the armrest. Nobody saw the combat veteran whose crisis management skills and emergency aviation expertise had been forged in situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between survival and catastrophe. The 777 climbed smoothly through 35,000 feet as the Texas landscape disappeared into darkness below. The seatbelt sign chimed off, and passengers unbuckled to stretch, retrieve laptops from overhead bins, and settle into the comfortable rhythm of a cross-country flight. The woman in 27C accepted a cup of coffee from the beverage service with a quiet thank you, still absorbed in her mystery novel while the businessman beside her tapped away on a spreadsheet and the elderly couple in front discussed their connecting flight arrangements. The cockpit crew ran through standard cruise checklists, monitoring fuel consumption and weather updates for the flight path ahead. Everything was completely, utterly routine. The kind of boring, uneventful flight that passengers forget the moment they deplane. Then, at 7:42 p.m. at 37,000 feet over the desert landscape of West Texas, everything went catastrophically wrong in the span of 11 seconds. The first indication of disaster came as a massive shuddering vibration that rippled through the entire airframe, violent enough to rattle overhead bins and send unsecured items flying through the cabin. Before passengers could even process what was happening, a deafening explosion tore through the aircraft's number 2 engine, sending shrapnel through the engine cowling and into critical flight control systems. The Boeing 777 lurched violently to the right as the destroyed engine created asymmetric thrust, and almost simultaneously, the number 3 engine began showing catastrophic pressure fluctuations on cockpit instruments. The pilots fought the control yoke as multiple warning alarms blared in the cockpit. Engine fire, hydraulic pressure loss, flight control malfunction, electrical system failure. The aircraft was literally coming apart in mid-air, cascading failures spreading through interconnected systems faster than the crew could process the emergency checklists designed for single-point failures, not the wholesale destruction of multiple critical systems occurring simultaneously. In the cabin, pandemonium erupted as oxygen masks dropped from overhead compartments and the aircraft entered an uncontrolled right bank that sent passengers and loose items sliding across tilted aisles. Flight attendants struggled to reach their jump seats as the emergency PA system crackled with the captain's strained voice ordering brace positions, the words barely audible over screaming passengers and the horrifying sound of metal tearing somewhere in the aircraft structure. The businessman in 27B clutched his armrest with white knuckles, his spreadsheet forgotten as his laptop crashed to the floor. The elderly couple in row 26 held hands and prayed as their grandchildren's photos scattered from a falling purse. Throughout the cabin, 183 people faced the terrifying reality that their routine flight had become a death sentence, that the ground was rushing up to meet them, that these were their final moments. The woman in 27C moved. In a single fluid motion, she dropped her book, unbuckled her seatbelt, and launched herself forward through the tilted cabin with a precision and purpose that cut through the chaos like a blade. She moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had trained for catastrophic emergencies in conditions that would paralyze ordinary people, her body automatically compensating for the aircraft's violent movements as she grabbed seatbacks for stability and propelled herself toward the forward galley. A flight attendant, strapped into a jump seat with tears streaming down her face, watched in shock as this random passenger moved through the chaos with military precision. The woman reached the cockpit door just as it swung open, the first officer emerging wide-eyed to assess cabin damage. She didn't ask permission. "I'm a pilot," she said, her voice carrying absolute authority that brooked no argument. "I can help. Let me in that cockpit right now." The first officer, drowning in alarms and cascading system failures, saw something in her eyes, a calm competence and absolute certainty that overrode every protocol about unauthorized personnel in the cockpit. He stepped aside. She pushed through the cockpit door and took in the situation with a single sweeping glance that processed information faster than conscious thought. Both pilots were fighting the controls, the captain pulling the yoke with both hands while the first officer worked rudder pedals against the asymmetric thrust trying to roll the aircraft inverted. The primary flight display showed a death spiral, altitude unwinding, airspeed fluctuating wildly, attitude indicators showing they were seconds from entering an unrecoverable dive. Engine 2 was completely destroyed, its remains dragging on the wing and creating massive aerodynamic disruption. Engine 3 was failing, oil pressure dropping toward zero as internal components tore themselves apart. Engine 1, on the opposite wing, was the only functioning power plant, but its thrust was actually making the situation worse by pulling the aircraft into a spin. "Talk to me," she commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos with the tone of someone who had coordinated combat missions under fire. The captain, sweat pouring down his face as he fought controls that were barely responding, managed to gasp out the situation. "Lost 2 engines, maybe losing 3. Hydraulics failing on 2 systems. Flight controls are degraded. We're at 32,000 feet and descending fast. Can't maintain altitude. Can't stop the roll. We're going in." She processed this information in milliseconds, her mind automatically running through emergency procedures that existed in classified training manuals most commercial pilots never saw. She had flown damaged aircraft before, had brought home machines that were structurally compromised and aerodynamically impossible. She knew what the textbook said about situations like this, how conventional emergency procedures assumed you still had basic flight control authority, that dual-engine failure protocols depended on having time to run checklists, that the official response to uncontrolled descent was to prepare for ditching or impact. But she also knew what the textbooks didn't say, what couldn't be written in official procedures because it required instinct and feel and a level of aviation mastery that couldn't be taught in simulators. "Throttle back engine 1, she ordered, her hands already reaching for controls. "You're fighting asymmetric thrust. Kill your good engine." The captain's training screamed that this was insane, that reducing thrust on their only functioning engine would accelerate their descent, that every procedure said to maintain whatever power you had. But something in her voice, some absolutely certainty, made him obey. His hand moved to the throttle. Engine 1 spooled down. And miraculously, impossibly, the aircraft's roll began to slow. Without the asymmetric thrust pulling them into a spin, the degraded flight controls suddenly had a chance to work. The woman's hands moved across the instrument panel with practiced precision, her fingers dancing over controls as she manually adjusted trim settings that the damaged flight computers couldn't automatically compensate for. She was flying by feel, using stick and rudder fundamentals that dated back to the earliest days of aviation, treating the massive Boeing 777 like a vintage aircraft that required constant manual correction. "Restart engine 1 at 20% thrust," she said, her voice absolutely calm as the ground continued rushing up toward them. "We need just enough power for control authority, not enough to roll us." The first officer's hands trembled as he worked the engine restart procedure, bringing the big turbofan back to life at barely above idle power. The aircraft was still descending, still wounded, but suddenly it was descending in a somewhat controlled manner rather than an uncontrolled death spiral. She studied the terrain display, processing options with the tactical awareness of someone who had planned combat missions in hostile territory. They were over West Texas desert, sparsely populated but with limited options for emergency landing sites. The nearest airport with a runway long enough for a 777 was El Paso International, but they were losing altitude too fast to make it. They had maybe 4 minutes before they'd be forced to put down wherever they could find ground flat enough to attempt a crash landing. "There," she said, pointing at the terrain display where a long, straight line appeared in the desert. "That's Interstate 10. 8 lanes wide, mostly straight, light traffic this time of evening. We're going to put this aircraft on that highway." The pilot stared at her like she'd lost her mind. Landing a Boeing 777 on a highway was insane, something that existed only in Hollywood movies, not in any actual emergency procedure manual. The aircraft's wingspan was 200 feet across, wider than the entire interstate including shoulders. The approach would have to be impossibly precise, threading the needle between overpasses and avoiding power lines, with no margin for error and no opportunity for a go-around if the approach went wrong. And they'd have to do it with degraded flight controls, failing hydraulics, and an airframe that was barely holding together. It was absolutely impossible. She had done impossible before. "I need you to trust me," she said, looking directly at the captain with eyes that had seen combat, that had stared down death and refused to blink. "I've landed damaged aircraft in worse conditions than this. I know what I'm doing. But I need you both to follow my instructions exactly, without hesitation, without second-guessing. Can you do that?" The captain, facing certain death if he continued flying conventionally and possible survival if he trusted this mysterious woman who had materialized in his cockpit, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life if it went wrong and define him as a hero if it succeeded. He nodded. "She has the aircraft," he said formally, the traditional transfer of command that gave her legal authority to control the flight. "I have the aircraft," she confirmed, her hands settling onto the controls with a confidence that seemed impossible given the circumstances. The next 3 minutes and 40 seconds became the stuff of aviation legend, a masterclass in emergency flying that would be studied in flight schools and analyzed in accident investigation reports for decades to come. She flew the crippled 777 with a combination of instinct and precision that seemed almost supernatural, making constant tiny adjustments to trim and throttle that kept the asymmetric airframe from rolling into another uncontrolled descent. She talked the first officer through manually extending the landing gear using the emergency backup system, knowing they'd need every bit of drag and stability for the approach. She had the captain coordinate with air traffic control, declaring an emergency and getting Interstate 10 cleared of traffic by state police and emergency responders who scrambled to set up a crash response along the highway straight section. In the cabin, flight attendants prepared passengers for crash landing procedures, demonstrating brace positions and evacuation procedures while trying to maintain calm despite their own terror. The woman's voice came over the PA system, no longer the anonymous passenger in 27C but now the commanding presence coordinating their survival. "This is the pilot. We have experienced multiple engine failures and are making an emergency landing on Interstate 10. The landing will be rough. Follow your flight attendant's instructions exactly. Brace for impact when commanded. We are going to get through this." Something in her voice, some absolute certainty that brooked no argument, gave 183 terrified people a reason to hope. She lined up the approach with precision that seemed impossible given the degraded flight controls and wounded airframe. The interstate stretched ahead like a narrow ribbon, bounded by desert scrub and the occasional overpass that represented obstacles they'd have to clear with almost no margin for error. She came in low and slow, the aircraft's massive wings extending beyond the highway's edge, wingtips passing within feet of light poles and road signs. The landing gear touched asphalt at 140 knots, far faster than normal landing speed but the slowest she could manage with the damaged aircraft. The impact was brutal, passengers slamming forward against restraints as the landing gear screamed against highway asphalt never designed for aircraft loads. Tires exploded from the excessive speed and weight, sending rubber fragments spinning into the desert. The aircraft bounced once, twice, threatening to porpoise back into the air where she'd lose all control. She worked throttle and stick with microscopic precision, bleeding off energy, keeping the wings level, refusing to let the wounded aircraft get away from her. The Boeing 777 scraped along Interstate 10 for nearly a mile, leaving a trail of torn asphalt and sparking metal, before finally grinding to a stop straddling the westbound lanes with its wingtips hanging over the desert on either side. Emergency evacuation slides deployed automatically, and flight attendants began the practiced chaos of evacuating 183 passengers from an aircraft that might explode or catch fire at any moment. People poured down the slides onto highway asphalt, many crying, some in shock, all incredibly and miraculously alive despite having just survived a crash landing that by every conventional measure should have killed them all. She stayed in the cockpit until every passenger was clear, helping the captain and first officer secure the aircraft and shut down the remaining systems. Only when the last passenger had been evacuated did she emerge from the cockpit, still wearing her gray hoodie and faded jeans, looking like she'd just finished a routine commute rather than executing one of the most extraordinary emergency landings in aviation history. The elderly couple from row 26 grabbed her in tearful embrace, not caring who she was, only knowing she had saved their lives and given them a chance to see their grandchildren again. The businessman from 27B stood staring at the woman who had been sitting next to him reading a paperback novel, unable to process that the quiet passenger he'd asked to pass him a pillow had just landed a crippled aircraft on a highway and saved everyone aboard. As emergency vehicles surrounded the crashed aircraft and paramedics began checking passengers for injuries, military aircraft that had been scrambled from nearby Air Force bases circled overhead. Standard protocol for major aviation emergencies included military oversight, coordination between civilian and military air traffic control, and fighter aircraft providing tactical support if needed. 2 F-22 Raptors from the 49th Fighter Wing at Holloman Air Force Base had been monitoring the emergency, tracking the crippled 777 on their advanced radar systems and coordinating with civilian authorities. The F-22 pilots had watched the impossible landing on their displays, seen an aircraft that should have crashed succeed in an emergency procedure that violated every conventional wisdom about crash survivability. They were already discussing the miraculous landing over secure military channels when the emergency coordinators began processing identification information on the pilot who had taken control and executed the landing. Her name entered the military database, cross-referenced with personnel files. matched to service records. And her call sign appeared on the F-22 pilot's displays. The secure military channel went completely silent. The F-22 Raptor pilots, flying the most advanced stealth fighters ever built, warriors who trained for combat against peer adversaries and prided themselves on their own exceptional skill, literally froze in their cockpits. For 10 full seconds, neither pilot said a word. They simply stared at the call sign displayed on their instruments, a call sign they had heard whispered with reverence in ready rooms and officers' clubs, a call sign that represented achievements so legendary that most pilots assumed the stories were exaggerated, that nobody could actually be that good. But here was the verification, the official confirmation that the woman who had just saved 183 lives on a highway in West Texas carried a call sign that commanded such profound respect that even F-22 pilots, the best of the best, the elite warriors of American air power, could barely comprehend they were in the presence of such aviation mastery. Confirm that call sign, the lead F-22 pilot finally managed, his voice tight with disbelief. Are we seeing what I think we're seeing? The tactical coordinator at the Military Emergency Response Center double-checked the data, equally stunned by what the database was showing. Confirmed. Call sign is authentic. That's actually her. The F-22 pilots exchanged glances across the formation, even though they couldn't actually see each other's expressions through their helmets and oxygen masks. They didn't need to. They both knew exactly what the other was thinking, that they were witnessing aviation history, that the woman standing on a Texas highway in civilian clothes was a living legend whose achievements made their own considerable skills pale in comparison. The secure military channel transmitted back to the Emergency Coordination Center, where military liaisons were coordinating with civilian authorities. The F-22 pilot's voice carried a tone of absolute reverence rarely heard in fighter pilot communications. Be advised, the pilot who executed that emergency landing is designated by call sign. He spoke her call sign, each syllable carrying weight, history, legend. Repeat, that is confirmed call sign for the aviator on scene. Request to extend our patrol for security support. That legend doesn't go anywhere without proper respect. Military personnel at the coordination center, many of them pilots themselves, reacted with similar shock and recognition. Her call sign meant something, represented achievements that transcended normal military service, embodied the kind of aviation excellence that inspired young pilots and humbled experienced ones. On the highway, as paramedics checked passengers and news helicopters began circling overhead, the woman in the gray hoodie stood talking quietly with FAA investigators who had already arrived on scene. She was explaining the emergency procedures she'd executed, walking through her decision-making process with the same calm clarity she'd shown in the cockpit. The captain and first officer stood nearby, still processing the fact that a random passenger had saved their lives and the lives of everyone aboard. "Who are you?" the captain finally asked, the question that had been building since she'd walked into his cockpit and taken command with such absolute authority. She hesitated, maintaining the privacy she'd carefully cultivated, the separation between her military service and civilian life. But the elderly couple was listening, and the businessman and flight attendants, and a growing crowd of survivors who wanted to know the identity of the woman who had given them back their lives. "I'm retired military," she said simply, offering the minimum explanation. "I have some aviation experience." "Some aviation experience," the first officer repeated, his voice edged with something between laughter and tears. "You just landed a Boeing 777 on a highway with multiple engine failures and degraded flight controls. That's not some experience. That's..." He trailed off, not sure how to finish the sentence. The businessman from 27B, who had assumed she was perhaps a teacher or retail worker, pulled out his phone and started searching, piecing together clues from the conversations around them, from the military aircraft overhead, from the way official personnel were looking at her with unmistakable recognition. His search led him to declassified military reports, to aviation history articles, to stories about a legendary pilot whose call sign represented achievements that seemed impossible. His phone screen showed her call sign, with articles describing missions and accomplishments that read like fiction. He looked up at the woman in the gray hoodie, then back at his phone, then up again. "You're her," he said, his voice rising with realization. "The pilot from... I read about the mission where you..." He couldn't finish, overwhelmed by the reality that he'd been sitting next to aviation royalty for an entire boarding process without having any idea. Other passengers began pulling out phones, searching, discovering, passing information through the growing crowd of survivors. The elderly woman from row 26 read an article about a combat mission where this woman had saved multiple lives under impossible conditions, and began crying again, this time from the overwhelming realization of who had just saved her life. The F-22 Raptors made another pass overhead, their stealth profiles barely visible in the darkening sky. The lead pilot's voice came over the civilian emergency radio channel, a breach of normal protocol but one he clearly felt compelled to make. Interstate 10 emergency site, this is Raptor flight. We've confirmed the identity of your pilot. Be advised, you have a national treasure on that highway. Her call sign is known and respected throughout the entire military aviation community. Request permission to provide aerial honor escort as she's transported to debriefing. The request was unprecedented, F-22 pilots offering to provide escort for a civilian emergency, but the tactical coordinator approved it immediately, recognizing the significance of what had just occurred. As news helicopters broadcast footage of the crashed 777 on the highway and word spread through military channels about who had executed the impossible landing, phones began ringing in the Pentagon, at Air Force bases around the world, in ready rooms where pilots gathered to watch the unfolding story. Her call sign appeared in news reports, in military communications, in social media posts from aviation enthusiasts who recognized what her designation meant. The legend that she had maintained such privacy around, the military service she'd kept separate from her civilian life, became unavoidably public as 183 survivors wanted the world to know that they owed their lives to one of the greatest aviators in history. She stood on that Texas highway as emergency vehicles' lights painted the scene in red and blue, as survivors embraced their families over phone calls, as military aircraft circled overhead in unprecedented tribute, and accepted that her anonymity was gone. The captain approached her with formal bearing, extending his hand in a gesture that transcended simple gratitude. I don't know what protocol is for thanking someone for saving 183 lives, he said, but whatever it is, it's inadequate. You gave all of us a future we shouldn't have had. You gave parents more time with their children, gave those grandparents more years to see their family grow, gave every person on that aircraft the rest of their lives. How do you thank someone for that? She took his hand, this woman whose call sign commanded such respect that F-22 pilots froze in awe, whose achievements filled classified reports and inspired young aviators, whose combat record read like legend made real. You do what I did, she said simply. You refuse to accept that the situation is impossible. You find a way when no way exists. You bring everyone home. It was the philosophy that had defined her career, that had earned her the call sign now being spoken with reverence around the world, that had just saved 183 lives against impossible odds. The businessman from 27B, who had spent the entire boarding process assuming she was completely ordinary, approached with obvious hesitation. I asked you to pass me a pillow, he said, the mundane request now seeming absurd given what he'd learned. I had no idea I was sitting next to. He gestured helplessly, unable to articulate the magnitude of who she was. She smiled, the same easy smile she'd offered when answering questions about her travel plans, when declining snacks, when being treated as just another anonymous passenger. That was the point, she said. I wasn't trying to be special. I was just trying to get home. But the universe had other plans. The mysterious woman in seat 27C who read paperback novels and wore gray hoodies had been revealed as one of the most legendary aviators in military history, a pilot whose call sign represented achievements that most aviators could only dream of matching. The F-22 Raptors circled overhead, their pilots still processing the reality that they'd just witnessed her execute another impossible feat, that the stories they'd heard about her weren't exaggerated but understated. Throughout military aviation communities worldwide, from Nellis to Lakenheath, from Kadena to Ramstein, pilots who had studied her missions and revered her call sign now had a new story to add to her legend. The night she saved 183 lives on a Texas highway, executing an emergency landing that shouldn't have been possible, proving once again that her reputation was earned through skill that transcended normal human ability. As investigators began the long process of documenting the emergency and examining the crashed aircraft, as survivors were transported to hospitals for evaluation and news crews broadcast the miraculous story worldwide, the woman who had been anonymous passenger 27C stood surrounded by people whose lives she'd saved, accepting gratitude she hadn't sought and recognition she'd deliberately avoided. Her call sign appeared in headlines, in military communications, in conversations among aviators who understood exactly what it meant to achieve the impossible. She had traveled as a civilian, dressed in jeans and a hoodie, deliberately maintaining separation between her extraordinary military service and her desire for normal life. But when 183 lives hung in the balance, when conventional procedures failed and disaster seemed certain, she had done what she'd always done, refused to accept defeat, found a way where none existed, and brought everyone home through sheer skill and absolute mastery of aviation. The F-22 pilots requested permission to land at a nearby Air Force base, wanting to meet the legend whose call sign they'd studied, whose achievements they'd analyzed, whose reputation preceded her throughout all military aviation communities. She accepted their tribute with the same quiet grace she'd shown throughout the emergency, understanding that her call sign meant something to these young pilots, represented standards they aspired to match. But as emergency responders worked through the night and survivors began the long process of recovering from their near-death experience, she remained focused on what mattered, that 183 people would see tomorrow, that families would remain intact, that the impossible emergency had become a survival story rather than a tragedy. Her call sign, spoken with reverence by F-22 pilots who literally froze in awe when they heard it, would forever be associated with the night she saved 183 lives on a Texas highway. The legend had grown, the reputation enhanced, but she remained fundamentally unchanged. A pilot who refused to accept impossible, who brought everyone home no matter the odds, whose call sign represented not just past achievements but an ongoing commitment to excellence that transcended normal human capability. She had been anonymous passenger 27C, overlooked and unremarkable. She had become the pilot who saved everyone, whose call sign commanded such respect that the best aviators in the world stopped and acknowledged they were in the presence of true mastery. And through it all, she remained who she'd always been, someone who simply refused to let anyone down, who found ways when no way existed, who embodied everything that her legendary call sign represented. The military debriefing that followed would become classified material studied at the Air Force Academy and Naval Postgraduate School for generations. Aviation experts from the National Transportation Safety Board analyzed every second of the emergency landing, frame by frame, trying to understand how she had achieved control authority with systems that should have made the aircraft completely unflyable. Senior test pilots from Edwards Air Force Base reviewed her decision to throttle back the functioning engine, a counterintuitive move that saved everyone but went against every instinct trained into commercial pilots. The consensus among experts was unanimous and humbling. No other pilot they knew could have executed what she accomplished. The specific combination of combat experience, test pilot precision, tactical decision-making under extreme stress, and pure stick and rudder mastery required to land that crippled 777 on a highway existed in perhaps a handful of aviators worldwide, and she was definitively one of them. 3 days after the emergency landing, a ceremony was quietly arranged at a secure military facility. The 183 survivors were invited, along with their families, to meet the woman who had given them their futures back. She arrived in her Air Force dress uniform for the first time since the emergency, her chest displaying ribbons and medals that told stories of valor most civilians couldn't fully comprehend. The elderly couple from row 26 brought their grandchildren, wanting them to meet a real hero. The businessman from 27B brought his daughter, explaining that the quiet woman who had sat beside him was the reason he'd be there to walk her down the aisle at her wedding next month. Flight attendants who had prepared passengers for what they thought would be certain death stood in formation, saluting a fellow aviation professional whose skill had validated their emergency training and given meaning to procedures they'd practiced but never expected to use successfully. The F-22 pilots from that night attended in their flight suits, these warriors of the sky standing at attention with genuine reverence for someone whose achievements eclipsed their own considerable skills. When she entered the room, 183 people who had faced death together rose as one, their applause thundering through the facility. She stood before them, this legend whose call sign was known worldwide, whose combat record inspired young aviators, whose emergency landing had just added another chapter to an already extraordinary career. "I didn't save you alone," she said, her voice carrying the same calm authority that had coordinated the impossible landing. "The captain and first officer trusted me when every instinct said not to. The flight attendants kept you calm and focused. You followed instructions when panic would have been understandable. We saved each other through teamwork, through trust, through refusing to give up. That's what my call sign really means, not individual achievement, but the absolute commitment to bringing everyone home together." Her words resonated through the crowd, but everyone present understood the truth, that without her specific skills, her impossible mastery, her refusal to accept defeat, none of them would be standing there. The businessman's daughter would have grown up without a father. The grandchildren would have lost their grandparents. 183 futures would have ended on a Texas highway. Instead, they had been given the gift of tomorrow, the chance to continue their stories, All because anonymous passenger 27C turned out to be a legend who proved that her reputation was earned through achievements that transcended fiction and became reality when lives hung in the balance.